Buenas tardes. Vamos a comenzar con la conferencia plenaria de esta jornada que, consiste en una exposición que va a realizar Gregory Sholette sobre tanto su trayectoria artística como las prácticas docentes que realiza con su alumnado de la Queen's College en la Universidad de Nueva York. Bueno, Gregory Sholette es un artista, es un activista, es como he comentado antes, un docente que tiene varios o numerosas publicaciones, capítulos de libros, artículos, intervenciones de todo tipo, pero debo destacar esta última publicación que la veis en la pantalla. Es un libro que justo va a salir muy próximamente en noviembre y es recoge sus últimos pensamientos en torno al arte y al activismo. Él va a hablar un poquito de ello en esta ponencia, pero como digo, también vimos conveniente que hablase de sus propios proyectos artísticos y de esa parte docente que es muy interesante, ¿no? Porque desarrolla un programa que codirige con Chloe Bass de Social Practice en la CUNY. Y creo que es como muy interesante, sobre todo para nosotros que estamos en el ámbito, ¿no?, de la Facultad de Bellas Artes, pues para coger ideas, ¿no?, y que poder implantarlas en nuestros propios programas docentes. Además de Art of Activism and the Activity of Art, que es el libro que hemos visto aquí, tiene otro que se llama Dark Matter, que tiene traducción al español, o sea, que puede encontrarlo, ¿no?, Materia Oscura, disponible, es muy recomendable. Y también Art as Social Activist, es otro de sus libros. Él, toda su producción está enfocada tanto al arte activista como al arte colaborativo, arte comunitario. Entonces, pues tiene especial interés en ese trabajo, ¿no?, interdisciplinar con la comunidad, con la sociedad, porque él ve, toda su práctica artística la ve enfocada de esa manera, ¿no? Es como el sentido que le encuentra más que un proyecto artístico individual sin esa conexión social. Tiene un doctorado por la Universidad de Ámsterdam y también es graduado del programa de estudios independientes de Whitney en teoría crítica. Y también es cofundador de numerosos colectivos artísticos con línea política por todo el mundo. Tenemos mucha suerte de tenerte aquí, Gregory. Te agradecemos que hayas aceptado nuestra invitación, que hayas venido desde Nueva York para estar con nosotros aquí en Murcia compartiendo. Y bueno, pues sin más dilación, como vamos muy mal de tiempo, pues os dejo con Gregory que seguro que os interesa más escucharlo que a mí. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Aurora. Buenas tardes, everyone. I'm going to speak in English. I'm sorry for that, but I believe someone's translating. Is that only on the internet, the translation? Oh. Okay, so if you wanted to see the Espanol, you could look at it on your. Okay, good. We have a. Okay.
Pues en auriculares va a ser difícil. No. Para los que estáis en Zoom, tenemos una traductora que va a ser la traducción simultánea. Tenéis que elegir en interpretación la traducción, o sea, está la opción de elegir traductor. Si estáis aquí, pues está la opción de con auriculares conectaros al Zoom y escucharlo. Muchas gracias.
Terrific. Okay. It's wonderful to be here, part of this program. Thank you, Aurora, for all the work you did, and your team. It was all good. Everybody back there, really terrific. Thank you. And it's really been an interesting program so far, and I'm looking forward to digesting it all. You're grappling with some interesting things. I was going to read from my new book, and I decided rather than read from the book, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got to the book. This is the book that I just published. It's just about now being sent through the mail if you ordered it. And yeah, it took a number of years to get to this book, but it's a very thin book, which tells you something about the period of time we're in, I think, the COVID and activism. Because I've been involved in art and activism since 1979, maybe not even earlier. And for many, many years, nobody really talked about art and politics, art and activism. It was considered a thing of the past, maybe from the 1930s, maybe from the 1960s. But in the 1980s, it didn't really have much of a presence until towards the end of the 80s, into the 90s, and now and then. But today activist and art is everywhere. It's like everywhere you look, right? People are talking about socially engaged art, social practice art, relational aesthetics, and activist art. So what this book tries to do is really create, I would call it an archival genealogy of activist art in the contemporary era, from the 1960s, let's say, to the present. I'm trying not to use the word history. I tried not to use the word history because I don't believe there is a history to this particular practice. And we can talk about that more maybe in our discussion. But how did I get to this point? That's what I really want to focus on. And I will start by telling you, I arrived in New York City in 1977 to go to school at the Cooper Union from Philadelphia, from the suburbs of Philadelphia, from a sort of, might say, upper working class family. I'm the only person who went to college in my family. New York was quite a place in the 1970s. It was quite rough. I lived on the Lower East Side, which I'll show you in a minute, and I studied with the artist Hans Haacke, the German artist. I'm sure some of you know his work, and he was quite influential on me. I'm going to talk about 3 artist collectives that I was part of and show you a lot of images. If I go too fast, just tell me to slow down a little. Okay. And I will also talk about, at the very end, this educational program. Does this sound okay and the recording's okay? Good. So it's important to understand the background, though, of New York City in the 1970s to just get a sense of where things are. This is where I moved to in 1977, which is this part of New York that is sometimes called the Lower East Side. Most of it's landfill. It was built in the late 19th century, actually, built out for immigrant communities who were working class communities. Germans, Jews, Irish, all different nationalities moved there, Italians. When I moved there in 77, there were like remnants of all these communities still there, and also Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and other people that had moved into that area as well. But this is what the city looked like near me, where I live. This is just a few blocks from where I lived. And when I show this today to people and they have an image of New York, they just can't believe it, right? Or my students, they look at me like, no, this is not true, right? But it really was true. And why was it like this? Well, for one thing, the late 1960s, 70s, there was a huge economic collapse across the industrial world, but in the United States. And by 1975, the city had gone bankrupt and its bond status had fallen to grade Z or junk bond status, which you would think that the federal government in Washington would say, well, this is one of the most important cities in the United States. We'll bail the city out. We'll give them loans, just like they did after the recent collapse in 2008, 2009, quantitative easing, it was called here in Europe. No. The new president who had taken over after Richard Nixon resigned in shame, Gerald Ford said, we're not going to bail the city out. He didn't say this. This is what the newspaper said. But basically, it was a new approach, which was to say, we're going to have a new era of taking off the sort of constraints from capitalism. We're going to let the free market, supposedly, do its job. And we're not going to provide any government bailouts. What did happen was financial institutions, private institutions bailed the city out under the mayor, which really changed a lot of things, because that meant that what we call FIRE, F-I-R-E, finance, insurance, and real estate in New York owns the city. And if you've been to the city, especially in recent years, you can see the result. It's just one big, extremely gentrified, very costly, financial, crazy, out of control place. But this is going back to the start of all that. So under the mayor, Mayor Koch, you had a lot of wealthy people who are now coming to the rescue of the city, which was kind of unusual. But then basically it was like a Faustian bargain. You know, they signed their name with blood, and today we pay the price for that. I want to look at the way artists responded to this or existed within it. So in 1980, so this is right about when things are starting to happen. It's also the year that Ronald Reagan is elected president, who is following along Margaret Thatcher's lines with this kind of neoconservative and what we would today call neoliberal approach to the economy. There were a lot of places, a lot of spaces in New York that were warehoused, which is to say, landlords were holding on to perfectly usable space, waiting for the price to go up. Meanwhile, people were becoming homeless left and right. Warehousing space. Speculators were buying places and just flipping them. You know, within a few days, they would then get another price for them. So things are starting to go out of control. A group of artists, a collective of artists, squatted a space, illegally squatted this space on Delancey Street, which is right in the middle of that map I showed you, right on the Lower East Side. And they created an exhibition called the Real Estate Show. This is literally the last few hours of 1979, just before 1980 started at 12 midnight. And the show was just a riot of imagery criticizing bankers and real estate people and speculators, and of course the octopus that is grabbing everything in its reach, right? Capitalism. Becky Howland created this octopus. Great, except that the police came within a few hours, and they locked the exhibition up. Now, I want to make one little detour. This is the kind of imagery these young artists were creating in 1980, but this was the art that we studied, my generation, minimalism and conceptualism. And so you can see right away a really big difference was taking place also in the nature of the aesthetic, let's say, right? From minimalism to this kind of cartoon, crazy street aesthetics, DIY, do it yourself. Punk was very big. And here's an example of Becky Howland's images, precisely targeting this nature of what wasn't even yet being called gentrification because it was too early. The police came, they locked the exhibition up because it was a squat, it was illegal occupation. They took a lot of the art, they threw it in the street, and it seemed like it was all over, except this guy in the hat happened to be in town doing his exhibition at the Guggenheim, Joseph Beuys. People knew him, I think, through his free school. And someone went and said, you know, would you come down to this exhibition? And he did. And the mayor, who was very, very self-conscious of his image, Mayor Koch used to say, how am I doing? If he ran into a New Yorker, you know, he was very self-conscious and he was so embarrassed that he gave this artist another space to put the show up. Not the same space, but a similar space. After that, he gave them a third space and they created this project called ABC No Rio, which still exists, except that the building is being renovated. It's a long story. But the point I'm making here is artists were beginning to respond to the situation in the urban space in a very different way than the people before them. The earlier artists had moved to Soho, Tribeca. They had big empty lofts. They had been abandoned. Suddenly, you're in a space that's very residential, and you're also dealing with that space. And what's happening, of course, is you're pushing up the rents for all the working class people that are there. It's not artists' fault necessarily, but their presence there started to have that effect on the neighborhoods. At the same time, in the same basic neighborhood, all galleries, a whole new batch of galleries opened up called the East Village Scene. And these were young artists, sometimes opening galleries, young commercial galleries, showing this new art, which was very different from minimalism and formalism and conceptualism. It was also a moment as the economy picked up and you had Wall Street making a lot of surplus money. What were these people buying? These young junk bond, traders, etc. They were buying this art that they could relate to. They couldn't relate to conceptual art and minimal art so much, but this art they could relate to because it uses cartoons, uses animation, things that they grew up with. And they had the extra money now from their Wall Street work to buy little paintings. Right? So also the paintings are relatively smaller, of course, than Jackson Pollock, let's say, or whatever. So you have a whole new art phenomena and a whole new art gallery scene taking place in the East Village. Graffiti art goes from the streets into the galleries during this period of time. It's quite interesting. It's also a very hip scene. So my professors like Hansaka used to dress like workers, they wanted to be seen as art workers. Well, you had Jean-Michel Basquiat, for example, wearing Armani, and painting, right? Wearing it's kind of a scene, a cultural scene, it's a fashion scene. Very, very different. But as you can see, the contrast here from Art in America page, where all the hip young artists are, 1984, and a neighborhood journal, a magazine, basically saying, fight the speculators, right? We got to take the neighborhood. The group of artists that I was involved with were called Political Art Documentation Distribution. I'm going to just call it PAD, P-A-D-D, PAD. It was started by Lucy Lepard and myself and a lot of other people with the idea of creating an archive of work about political art, which again, remember, 1980, this is 1980, people are not interested in the art world, in politics and art. They just consider this a throwback, to another era. So this was a very curious phenomena. And our idea was we would make an archive and then we would share it with people. And then people would get ideas about how they could make political art. In other words, it was a teaching tool. This was the newsletter we created. It's a piece by Rashid Areen, who you may know, who created Third Text Journal. Some of you may be aware of that. We did things like this, create art for demonstrations. This was a war, image war on Pentagon, where we didn't want all these things, tanks, bombs, etc. And if you flip these around, there were images of like bread, hospitals, all the things we did want. This is like 1982, 83. The idea, get the art out of the studio, get it into the street. This one I love, and I don't know where this is. It probably got destroyed, but it's an inflatable Uncle Sam Pac-Man. And some of you are old enough to remember Pac-Man. And here it is in a demonstration, right? Gobbling up everything in sight, right? The project that I worked most intensively on in this group, so it was a group of many people, was a project against gentrification. Because I was living in that neighborhood and it was already starting to gentrify, we could see. And we could also see that artists and art galleries were playing an important role in that gentrification process. You're all pretty familiar with that now. We could talk about it, but I think you understand. This was kind of early on though, and we were making the connections and we said, okay, let's do an exhibition that really draws attention to art and gentrification. Let's try to get this out in the public. And so we created an exhibition in 1984 called Art for the Evicted, the Lower East Side is Not for Sale, not for sale. And we asked artists, and of course we didn't have the internet then, we would tell people, we would leave information in cafes and other things, please make 20 posters about the situation in the East Village, give them to us, and then we're gonna put them up in these galleries. Come back to that in a minute. We created 4 galleries because remember now, there's galleries all over the East Village. So we created our own galleries. The Leone Humsley. Leone Humsley was a major real estate developer who went to jail for basically tax evasion. We hope someone else goes to jail for tax evasion, among other things, soon. Same idea, right? same thing as the ex-president. Another gallery done in a graffiti style because the graffiti arts moved into the galleries. Guggenheim downtown. There was no Guggenheim downtown. Guggenheim had not actually started to franchise itself, really. It was just starting with this idea. And I'm going to come back to the Guggenheim at the end. You get the idea. And of course, it's like a travel bag, as if you have to leave the neighborhood. And we put them up in the streets. This is what the streets look like. They were just covered with graffiti, not with graffiti, well, also graffiti, but posters, flyers. If you put something up in the street, you had to go back 2 days later or a day later because it would just get covered over. It's like a living organism that kept changing. But our show, our galleries, were not in inside spaces. We claimed 4 spaces in the street to be our galleries. So our galleries themselves were a kind of critique of the idea of the gallery. And this was a corner gallery. This is a speculator ominously walking around the neighborhood. Another project in the same area, zoom in on this because, as I said, the neighborhood was largely, a lot of people spoke Spanish because they're either Puerto Rican or Dominican, but there was also Asian, Chinese primarily, there was Ukrainian, there was Polish, really a mixed neighborhood, and many people who come out of the radical 60s era as well in this area. Street stencils, borrowing from Picasso, among other things. But here you see the notice, we're asking artists to pay attention to what they're doing, right? We're not blaming everything on the real estate speculators. We're also asking artists to think about what they're doing. And this is the opening we had in the summer of 1984. You see some of the posters that are there that we could put on this wall. Today, this is the corner of 10th Street and Avenue A, and it's like a fancy cafe. But then it was just a boarded up building. And you can see we put the names of the galleries at the top, Guggenheim downtown. And we had our opening here in the street. So that was a project that in many ways taught me a lot about working collectively, working with other people, but also working in public space. Needless to say, we didn't stop gentrification. And I think that's something we should talk about, like how it is you can do activist art and kind of fail a lot. But nevertheless, a few years later, I started another collective with a bunch of other people. Lucy Lepard was also involved in this group. And we had a slightly different approach. Public space was still key, but it was a different idea, which I'll show you. For example, this is not part of the project. You probably don't know the artist Stuart Davis, but in the 1920s, he was a very well-known abstract painter in the United States. This is a plaque that was outside the place that he had his studio on 13th Street in New York. And it's not particularly interesting except for one thing. It talks about how he was interested in jazz, in this and that. It doesn't say that Stuart Davis, the painter, was one of the most important theorists of the Communist Party in the United States. It's just not there, right? I mean, we know that America is very anti-communist, okay, whatever, but nevertheless, it's a fact, right? So our project was, let's talk about the histories that people don't know, that are missing, that have been forgotten or erased in some cases. And so we came up with a group called Repo History, repossessing history, but the real name came from the movie Repo Man. I'm sure you've all seen this movie. Okay, you have to watch this movie. That's your homework, okay? But it's a crazy film about people who repossess other people's property because they haven't made the payments on it. So you don't finish paying your car payment. The repo man comes and when you're not looking, takes your car, drives it back. Right? Our idea was, let's become the repo men and women of histories that people don't know about. Let's take them and put them back in the street. So we literally got permission. It's a long story. At first, we were just going to do it guerrilla style, but we got permission to put signs up for 1 year under the first African-American mayor, David Dinkins, and until recently, the only. And so we went out and we started putting up these signs that we created, which told alternative, not even alternative histories, true histories that people didn't know. The front of the sign had an image, the back had a text, and they had numbers because we had a map so you could walk around and you could find all the signs. 60 some artists participated in this project. We marked the site where the slave market was in New York City. So, you know, before abolition in the North, slavery was legal in New York under the Dutch. And on Wall Street, not far from where the stock market is, there was the slave market. So we marked that for 1 year with this sign. We marked the site where a man who nobody would know died basically he lived in the street. He was a homeless person. And his parents gave the two artists who made his picture and said, could you create a memorial to my son? You know, this was, again, this is 1992. And that's an important year, which you think about for a minute, you're very connected here to this question of 1992. And our idea was to sort of, you know, counter the histories that people thought they knew. Marina Gutierrez, who's a Puerto Rican and Czechoslovakian artist, actually, did a piece about Vito Marcantonio, who was an Italian legislator, a local congressperson who represented an Italian and Puerto Rican neighborhood. And so he was like a very interesting person who crossed these ethnic lines. And he was also very, very left-wing. This would be in the 1940s. He was not a communist, but he was close to a communist. So we marked all these things that people just didn't know about, including this image. And again, this is 1992, advantages of an unregulated free market economy. The image, of course, is meant to represent 1930, or when the stock market crashed, 1929, when the stock market crashed, and people threw themselves out of windows because they had lost a fortune. It's a bit of an urban myth. And people who had a lot of money made a lot of money when the stock market crashed, as they always do. But some of the smaller investors did kill themselves. I want to ask you, I could draw on the board like Coco, but I'm going to ask you a question. Where do you think we put this sign in Manhattan if you were going to put it up? Exactly, right outside the stock exchange, exactly. And if you look, you see the blue flag? It was the 200th anniversary of the stock exchange by coincidence. And they were really angry because on the back of the sign, it talked about the birth of neoliberalism, really. I mean, we didn't use that term then, and they said, they called up the people who gave us the permit and said, you have to take this sign down. And the person there said, no, they have a permit. They get to keep it up. You know, this is before Giuliani. So it's very interesting that this administration was very friendly to artists and was willing to take a risk. There's a little bit better shot. You see the stock exchange behind it. We got press. We didn't get a lot of art press. We got a lot of press in the mainstream newspapers, but that was good because then many, many, many people saw this project and could go and walk around and look at the signs. The same year, 1992, we also did a project about the history of abortion, how women have used abortificants, herbs, self-care to sort of control their sexuality. And this was at Artist Space in New York. It was a busy year. And now I think you had enough time, 1992. Why was it 92? Anybody want to tell me? Nope. Good guess. No, that was 2 years later. Yeah. It's connected to Spain, but the person I'm thinking of is Italian. Yeah, exactly. It was the quincentennial 500th anniversary of Columbus supposedly discovering the New World. So our exhibition was part of a series of exhibitions that were like, wait a minute, this is not a celebration. Let's talk about all the people that are not being represented. And there was an exhibition in each of the boroughs, Manhattan, Brooklyn, et cetera, and ours was in Manhattan. So it was quite an interesting context to be in. Several years later, after Giuliani was elected, we did a project about queer, trans, and gay, spaces, queer spaces. This is about a trans person who was probably gay bashed, was killed by gay haters, you know, basically, and Marsha Johnson. And now she has actually a very interesting documentary you can look at. But we put this up in the area that's now become extremely gentrified art scene in New York City, the meatpacking industry. So I can point you to more material on this because I have to go through a lot and I don't want to go over. But this is 1994, and Giuliani's now mayor, and he tries to stop this project, but he can't. Then we do another project, 1998, and he does actually stop it temporarily for a bit. So we did this piece from 1998 by Jenny Pollock and David Thorne, because each of these projects was done by different people, but it was all collected under the repo history. And this is about police killing young people of color. So from 1994 to 96, 75 people were killed, shot in back, shot in head, pinned face down and shot, choked, hogtied and crushed, beaten to death, etc., by New York City police officers. Only 3 officers were convicted of crimes and 0 for murder. This is all before, of course, George Floyd and all the terrible things that have happened recently. This is 1998, and clearly the Giuliani administration saw this sign and said, they're not getting a permit. No way, this isn't going to happen. We took the city to court. Marina Gutierrez, again, with a different sign about housing. We took the city to court and we actually won. And they had to give us a permit for 1 year. And we did put the sign project up. And it was a very interesting project. It was really the last sign project though, because after that, Giuliani's administration closed all the loopholes. Any way you could do a project like this again, that was it. There were a lot of artists groups in New York that got very angry at us because we had just ruined this venue. You know, we couldn't do public art like this anymore, but that's sometimes what happens. Now, I'm going to show the third group, and we're going to come back to the Guggenheim in a funny way. This is the most recent group that I've been part of, and it started in 2010, and it still exists, but I'm going to put 2017 because it's really when we stopped being active. Gulf Labor Coalition, started by Andrew Ross, the sociology, cultural studies person, Walid Raad, artist from Lebanon, and a whole lot of other people. This is Saadiyat Island, and it means kind of island of happiness, island of good fortune in Arabic, but it's anything but that. This is an island right off Abu Dhabi, a desert island, although today it's not a desert anymore. This is a cartoon by Pablo Helguera, which if you're familiar with New Yorkers, it's very, very funny. So now in 2010, the Guggenheim has started to create copies. Bilbao, I'm sure you know, here in Spain, in Basque Country, right? And we could talk about that as well, because it's an interesting phenomenon in the art world. They decide they're going to build a Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi on this island, this desert island. And I took these pictures on a research trip there. And this was the idea. Frank Gehry, the star architect or starchitect, as we call him, came up with this enormous, the biggest Frank Gehry ever imagined would be this fabulous new Guggenheim. Here it is on the bottom of the island. The island is now terraformed here. You can see it's gone from a desert to becoming like a lush paradise for the ultra wealthy and their children. If you look off to the side, you'll see the Louvre, which actually has been built since then. The Guggenheim has not really been started yet. It's only barely started. The question we asked, the question Gulf Labor asked is, who builds your architecture? It's one thing to have these great visions and all this kind of excitement. And the Guggenheim, of course, would be a contemporary art museum. But who is actually building the architecture? And here's where the problem is. The people who do the manual work In Abu Dhabi, as well as Sharjah, as well as Dubai, that whole region, Qatar, are workers who come from other countries around the surrounding region, North Africa, from other parts of the Middle East, from the Philippines, other places, and they come under certain circumstances. Of course, they go there to make money to send back to their families because they can make more money there than they can at home. But the problem is there's a system called kafala. And if you're going to go to this, to one of these countries, you have to pay a fee to a recruitment person. Sometimes it's quite a bit of money. And once you arrive, you discover you have to pay that person back. Sometimes it's 3 years of your wages. So you're going there and you're working really for free for 3 years. You get housed, you get fed, but you're basically an indentured servant. That's the first problem that we addressed. We told the Guggenheim Museum, you can't build this museum unless you address these problems. Workers arrived, they discovered that the working conditions are mostly very, very bad, even though they've been told they'd be very good. And so that's the second demand, improve the working conditions. And third, allow the workers to organize for better wages, for better demands. If you try to organize in the United Arab Emirates region or Saudi Arabia or any of these places, you basically are going to be deported, if not jailed, right? So these were the three concerns that we had, and we went to the Guggenheim and we said, listen, you know, you're an American Western corporation. If you're going to build this new facility in this part of the world, why not build it with the proper contracts, let the workers get fair pay, show them that it can be done, right? Show them they don't have to rely on the kafala system. You can be like a sort of shining example, right? And Richard Armstrong, we would go to these meetings, these big tables at the Guggenheim. Richard Armstrong would say, "Oh, of course, it's terrible. We agree with you. You know, these are terrible conditions. But what can we do? What can we do? It's up to the Saudi, you know, the Emirates people, the Saudis, to do something." And we said, "What you're not getting, you know, paid for them to use your brand?" Well, you know. Finally, after they wouldn't discuss it anymore, we called for a boycott. And in 2010, we called for a boycott and thousands of people signed this boycott. What was the boycott about? Well, remember, the Guggenheim is a contemporary art museum. So people like Walid Ra, Emily Jassir, all these artists from the Middle East were going to be part of the collection. And if they said, we're never going to give you our art until you fix this problem, then the Guggenheim has a difficulty. They can't build a collection in the Middle East, right? That was the first step. Of course, once that happened, the art world, the New York Times, everybody wanted to talk about it. And then the Guggenheim said, please come back, let's talk some more. Blah, 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 more talk, no action, right? It didn't do anything. So we came up with another idea. 52 weeks of Gulf labor. In other words, every week, some artist would create a work about the problem, and we would put it up on our website. We would do something to make it visible. So all kinds of people worked on this with us. Andrea Fraser, Thomas Hirschwer, all kinds of people submitted work. The Illuminators, which is a group in New York that has a big truck with a big sort of projector on it, went and did the projection on the building, the keynote, the Frank Lloyd Wright building. It's a truck because it's illegal, so they can drive away if the police come. And then we turned up the volume a little more. Another part of the group became what's called Gulf, Global Ultra Luxury Faction, Gulf. And on one morning, May Day, May 1st, 2015, we met nearby the Guggenheim. This is near the Metropolitan Museum across the way. And we practiced. The young lady in the wheelchair is not disabled. We went inside the Guggenheim, and at 10 a.m., she jumped off of the wheelchair and we pulled out this huge banner meet workers' demands now in the center of the Guggenheim. And at the same time, people began to throw flyers down to explain in many different languages what we were doing, why we were there. There had been several other interventions like this, but this time we decided we were going to occupy the building. So we didn't leave. We sat down. Not everyone, but about 10 or 12 people refused to go. At one point, the police came and they said, you know, we're going to be coming here soon with a wagon and we're going to grab you and take you out. And we thought, really? You know, the Guggenheim's going to let a bunch of artists be taken out in handcuffs? I don't think so. And we just sat there and they didn't, they disappeared. The one thing was that several of us, myself included, had tickets to Venice, Italy the next day, because Okwi and Wezer, curator, the late curator, had asked Gulf Labor to be in the Biennale that year. And so we were flying to Europe the next day and we were hoping, I hope we don't get arrested because we're not going to go anywhere. The police left. That was it. We went to Venice. We were part of All the World's Futures, the 2015. And of course, we were going to cause trouble there too. At one point, the last time I saw Okwi alive, he came up to me and said, the Guggenheim is really upset that you're in this exhibition. I said, good, can we talk about that in public? And he said, no. We came up with a plan. As you know, the Peggy Guggenheim collection is on the Grand Canal in Venice. And we decided, okay, let's occupy the Peggy Guggenheim Museum. This is the same day that the Americans are going to have their opening of the exhibition at the Peggy Guggenheim. We worked with a group called Sally Docks. Some of you may know this group in Venice. It's a very interesting occupied space in Venice. And they arranged to have boats, and we got together and we did a marine landing on the dock outside of the Peggy Guggenheim, jumped off the dock, occupied it, put flyers up so that people going by would see it on the Vaporetti, and we refused to leave. At one point, though, we saw this, and we thought, oh my God, okay, they've actually called out the police, but this looks like the right police. It's going to be really scary. And then we looked again, and we're like, why they're saluting us? And we realized, oh, it's an art project. It's part of the Biennale. So we stayed there till late in the day. Finally, the Guggenheim people said, listen, you got to go. We will meet your demands. We will let you meet with our board of directors. That was our key demand, because we had to get above the director, Richard Arms. We had to get up higher. We did that. We met with them, and they agreed to listen to all kinds of contracts that could be used, all kinds of ways they could do this work. And then a couple of months later, they said, we're not going to do anything. And they broke faith with us. And then we did more projections on the building. One of the things that did happen was oil prices crashed. This is 2017. And so probably in part, the project itself just was like, okay, we're not going to go ahead with this project at this time. I'd like to think that Gulf Labor forced the museum to stop, but I think it was mostly an economic issue. And today they claim they're going to start building it again for like 2026. I think they claim they're going to finish it. We'll see. I don't know. So those are three projects that over the years I've been involved with as an activist that led me to write this book, to try to really think about what's the context for activist art, right? It's not like Cubism or Surrealism where you can see, you know, there was a manifesto, there's certain rules that people follow, there's certain things that, it just isn't the same phenomena. And so the book is really structured around the idea that it's an archive of sorts, not a history. It's a sort of genealogy in the Foucaultian or the Nietzschean sense, right? It's a branching phenomenon. And this we took just before we left the Guggenheim. Always ambiguous what winning means in this context. The last thing I'll do, is it okay for just a few more minutes? I'll just show you this educational project, because along with my writing, education is really, really a big part of what I do. And all of these activist things feed into not just my research and my art, but also my work with students. And so along with the artist Chloe Bass, we've created a special program at the City University where we try to get young people to see ways to connect art with social justice. And in the process, develop leadership skills amongst young people who are mostly people of color. They're immigrants and they're first generation college, just like I was, really, because that's what the City University that's mostly who actually studies at the City University. It's not, well, compared to Europe, it's very expensive, but compared to, say, Columbia or NYU, it's very cheap. It's really for working class people. And so just to give you a real quick sense, we have a cohort of people, which includes students and faculty members who get some money. And we just started our new cohort. They get some money. These are just some of the faculty people. And I'll explain this because Chloe and I realized that City University is an enormous system. There's like 20 some different facilities, community colleges like the one I teach at, all kinds of things. And in this system, there's many people who are doing this kind of work, socially engaged, art teaching of one type or another, but nobody's talking to anybody else because the system is set up like this. You know, everybody's on their own island. So we were able to kind of create a structure where people could talk to each other, create a network inside the system. So we provided funding for artists, and then we also, for teaching artists, and then we have a group of students. And we have quite a few faculty here. And the students from Queens College actually get full tuition for the second year of their MFA. Others get a few $1,000s. And for 1 year, they go through this. It's not a full program. It's like one seminar. I'm teaching the seminar this semester. Chloe will teach it next semester. And then they submit projects, which if you go to the website, you can find projects here. And the project continues. And let me just say, the last thing I'll say is, this was not funded by the City University. You know, this was actually funded by the Mellon Foundation, which is a private foundation, because the City University really wouldn't support this. I mean, not because they're opposed to it, because they're just completely broke. And so we had to go outside to actually get funding to make this happen, just to give you some sense of what goes on in terms of higher education in the United States. So I'm going to stop there. I know it's a lot of stuff, but I'll be interested to have a conversation with you, and I can elaborate more on anything. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Gregory. Creo que por aquí hay muchas manos alzadas. Vamos a pasar bueno, a un turno de preguntas. Y bueno, pues, y antes de decirte que me ha encantado todo lo que has contado. Me voy a poner de saber de estar más. Voy a hablar de los directos para conocer más acerca de los procesos que hemos abordado y también acerca de tu trayectoria y los proyectos que me has explicado, que bueno, nos han abierto muchas vías, ¿no? de investigación y de análisis posterior.
Okay.
Hola, Gregory, gracias por tu presentación, me ha gustado mucho. Quiero hacerte una pregunta, pensando en tu larga trayectoria en relación a arte y activismo. y las relaciones entre arte y movimientos sociales. En un momento como este, en el que los partidos de extrema derecha, los movimientos de extrema derecha se están apropiando de las estrategias que inventaron los grupos o los colectivos o los movimientos sociales de izquierdas a lo largo de los últimos 30, 40 o 50 años, ¿cómo crees que se va a modificar el curso de la producción de las prácticas artísticas subversivas o de los movimientos sociales en función de ese proceso de apropiación que la extrema derecha está tomando en todos los sentidos políticamente?
He really appreciated your talk, and he was really interested in this long history of activist art. But he was also wondering, what do you think now that the right wing, extreme right wing, all over is appropriating the strategies that activist art has always used? How do you see the future and also the present of the kind of art that you've been talking about and writing about and producing with this new scenario?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Okay. Very hard question. I try to address it in the book a bit. I talk about the January 6th action at the Congress building in Washington. And I try to unpack some of the American far right and also other places. And one of the things that I see as a difference comes back to this question of the archive for me. So what artists tend to draw from often is previous art projects, previous works, and especially activists. They don't always even know that they're borrowing an idea that someone did before, but they recycle it, they reappropriate it, they reinvent it. And it's an open-ended process vis-a-vis, I think, art and activism, as opposed to the far right, who do appropriate some aspects of this, but it always tends to, how would you say, pivot or come back to a kind of idea of the past, very fixed idea, white supremacy, nationalist identities, religious identities. And so the key difference for me, at least, is vis-a-vis the arts, there's a kind of opening out onto various ways of reappropriating history, whereas the far right has tended to come up with this kind of ridiculous, almost Hollywood idea of authoritarianism and repeats that in a very particular way. So it's not exactly an answer because there's no answer really. The far right has used the same artistic ideas before. Filippo Marinetti's and the futurists, they invented the avant-garde in many ways. So we also have to be very aware that the whole concept of the avant-garde has a very strong tradition in fascism, or syndicalist type fascism, right? Let's be honest. So there has always been this link between the disruptive aspects of art and the potential for the far right, I think, to use that. So it's not a new phenomena, but for me, it's a phenomenon that is looking backwards. Whereas I think Black Lives Matter and other activists are kind of like looking at history, but they're also looking forward, a kind of Afrofuturism, if you will. They're thinking ahead. That's my feeling about it. Yeah. I would be interested to hear what you think, though, or anyone, because it's a difficult question. It really is.
Que te refieras a la derecha extrema o la extrema derecha,
es lo que creo que el conflicto del lenguaje entre lo que él está diciendo, ¿no? ¿No crees? Porque lo que te está diciendo es eso, que el arte ha estado muy relacionado con la extrema derecha, como el futurismo y todo esto, ¿no? Si no me equivoco, ¿no? A ver.
Bueno, lo que ha dicho es que no es un fenómeno nuevo, que ha sucedido otras veces y que las estrategias del fascismo siempre han tenido que ver con apropiarse de lo que otros han pensado de una manera vanguardista, o es decir, que no creo que, o sea, creo que he entendido perfectamente que he hablado del trumpismo, de hecho, o sea, yo he hablado de Trump, bueno, luego salí en la traducción que he hecho de la pregunta, no ha incluido a Trump, pero yo, o sea, creo que he entendido perfectamente que la extrema derecha es parte de todo ese proceso de estrategia. No sé qué, o sea, qué problema tienes con el término extrema derecha. O... Bueno, los partidos de extrema derecha en Valencia, por ejemplo, se llaman Solidaridad.
No, que tú lo que dices es que en la política, los políticos, la extrema derecha se apropia de arte.
Sí, claro, también, mira, te puedo explicar muchos casos. La estrategia política electoral de Bolsonaro se fundamenta...
Aurora?
¿Pero por qué crees que se ha perdido? Ha entendido perfectamente lo que le he preguntado.
Aurora, let me hear. Yeah.
Bueno.
Gregory, it's long to translate. This lady thought that Diego hadn't understood you, but Diego had understood you, and he was explaining that he had understood you, and he was giving some examples of different strategies in Spain, where the far right has used these strategies.
Yes.
Okay, I think it's better to summarize that because there are other questions.
Yeah. One of the things we see in the United States with the far right is they will say things that like you're not letting me have free speech, which is like, classic liberal position. So I have the right to say horrible things, let's say, about whatever, people of color, immigrants, because that's free speech, right? And so they use this kind of technique of sort of like reversing the situation. It's very complicated, I think. It's harder for liberals, I think, than for people on the left, because people on the left really don't trust the far right anyway. It's not like, oh, we're listening to you. No, you're full of shit. We know you're screwing with us, right? But it's complicated. I totally agree. And in the arts, I think it's particularly complicated. Yeah. I really want to do more research on this. So I would be very interested in, not even now, like if you send me emails and say, hey, listen, I was thinking about this, that would be very good. So, any other questions? Anything else?
I'm from Mexico.
Yeah. Use them. They're recording it, so for posterity.
Thank you. I'm from Mexico, and I teach art downtown, just behind the National Palace, where the president serves, or whatever he does. And when we do projects, reclaim streets or do any project, they just don't say anything. They just let it die. They won't send the police. They won't let us, go after us. They just wait us to die. So
yeah,
that is have you heard of this strategy? Because it's very, it's very frustrating, because you're protesting, you're there,
right.
you burn the whatever, you stare out sculptures or whatever, and they just won't do nothing.
I think that's really an interesting, of course, when we think back to 1968 in Mexico City and the terrible slaughter that took place, right, and that history, and there are a lot of very interesting collectives also that came out of that period, Processo Pentagone and other groups, it's interesting that they would evolve that strategy, and I don't know a lot about it. I'd like to know more about it. It does make me think in a funny way about the Gezi Park demonstrations in Turkey, when people decided they would just stand. There was one, I think, gentleman, a poet, and he just stood there. So he wasn't doing anything that they could arrest him for, and they didn't know what to do, right? It would like it flipped the switches. Something similar happened in Belarus recently. And remember 2020, everyone in Belarus was in the streets, not everyone, but many people denouncing Lukashenko, who was the president. And people would do things where they would like refuse to sort of take an action, but they would just stand there and it would make the police go kind of crazy. But I haven't heard about this kind of reversal of that, which is really intriguing. Obviously, there's a threshold, I'm sure, where the police would do something. But it brings us back to the question of whether or not the aesthetics of protest, as they're generally practiced, do actually constitute a safe space within a certain idea of liberal democracy. And therefore, they can be annulled, as you say, by simply being accepted, right? It's a little bit like when the Guggenheim decides to have their own social practice program, which they did, or when the museum decides to have a show of activist art. And we think to ourselves, why are they doing this? Because we're trying to critique the museum. Of course, it only goes so far. You can only go so far with this because at some point the institution says that's too much. But nevertheless, I think they have learned that they can accept a lot of this without a problem. And this is something that the theorist Herbert Marcuse talked about as a kind of repressive tolerance. The society tolerates a certain amount of dissent to prove its liberalism, to prove that it can accept dissent, right? And it's only by the refusal. This is, remember, Marcuse's idea was this idea of refusing to participate completely, not just a general strike, but a strike about a cultural strike, an everything strike. I'm not going to just go to stop working because I want more pay. I'm going to just stop working. I think something like this happened in Italy with the autonomous, Aparista movement. The idea of just refusing to participate is one alternative, right? It's all very complicated, I think, at this point. Mm-hmm.
During demonstrations,
yes,
for the women that are being killed or whatever, the government enters the system, and then they organize also with the society. Mm-hmm. And so now they're part
yes
of the
right
of the protest.
But how are they managing with the revelations?
In Mexico, every day there 11 women die.
Yeah.
And nothing is done.
Yeah.
And it's not this government or the past, it's been 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
And there's been art in the border. There's been a lot of books, and my university has a special program for the violence of women, and suddenly it's part of the system, Yeah. And there are no arrests, mm-hmm. There are no guilties, there are not one.
Yeah. Let me just ask one question though. Yeah, let me ask one question though. This recent revelation about the government's involvement in the student killings, right? Has that shaken things up a little?
That was in 68.
No, I mean the 40.
The
43.
There's so many stories.
Yeah.
There's so many. Now there's legends. The president that we have now,
right?
He promised that he would solve the case 2 days after he took power, and nothing's
really happened. Yeah,
nothing,
right.
Nothing.
Yeah.
The other government told that it was López Obrador who was the one that.
Okay, right. You can always say it was somebody else. Yeah, I know, right?
No, someone else has it.
You're raising a very interesting problem, I think, and that's the question: does culture is culture really the place where you can change things today, right? And including the academy. I think we had this conversation early with David Harley, was that his name? Who at the, was talking about his intervention, and it was very interesting. But at the end of the day, it really goes back into the system, and it sort of doesn't seem to change. His point, and it's worth considering, was, well, it's a slow process. You do a little more, and eventually, right? Maybe. Or maybe the system has figured out that these kind of things don't really matter, You can be an artist, you can say whatever you want, you can be trans, you can be angry, you can be a feminist. Good for you. But, basically you're making art. That's what you're doing, and so we don't care. This is one problem I think artists face, is that in these Western style democracies, you're basically allowed to be an angry revolutionary, even. It doesn't matter. It does matter elsewhere, though, as we've seen. I mean, yeah, very much. Yeah, Iran, Russia. I mean, the new book I talked briefly about Afghanistan, Syria, all these kind of Hong Kong, where art activists did a lot of work, and it really did, of course, change, bring about repression, if nothing else. But in the West, it's a funny moment we're in. So there is this concept of abolition and complete withdrawal that has come back up again. I'm not even going to be part of the system. I'm just going to leave. I think, Fred Moten, I'm sure some of you read his work. He raises many of these same kind of questions. Yeah, it's really great that you're a Marxist or a leftist in the system, but nothing has changed, right, for like decades. So what are you really doing, teaching students a critique that just seems to fold itself back into the very same system? I'm not that pessimistic. I mean, I do believe it's important to raise the critique. We also have to raise the critique of the critique, which we're doing right now, and ask that very question. How does the critique maybe fold into the system, and how could it maybe take itself out? Okay. And I think that this is one of the main trajectories of the book, is to look at, you might say, the post-war era in general as a shift away from a certain kind of politics towards the politics of culture. So you have really people just sort of taking the idea of Antonio Gramsci in the 60s, really, let's say 60s and after the 60s, and starting to apply that, saying the field of politics is really the field of culture. And that's pretty exciting. It was very exciting, okay, you also had the counterculture, you had all these things that were happening. And then all of a sudden it seemed like capitalism, let's say, came along and said, great, let's turn this into an advertisement, counterculture, yeah, right, let's sell some more cars, or let's sell some more sneakers, or sell some more iPhones, right? And so this is, I think, part of the answer to the question, at least an analysis, not an answer, the solution, is that we've become so much of a consumer culture that acting within culture is itself part of that consumption cycle. We need to start thinking about, well, where is power really resting, right? And how do we get to that, whether we're artists or whether we're activists, right? I think it's a very, very, for the left, it's a very, very demanding moment, because the left has failed. It really has failed. And part of it is, I think, and I'm not the only person that says this, because of this shift towards a complete investment in the idea of culture, which capitalism is very good at propagating. And I think it's a difficult, I'm not down. I love art. I love abstract art. I love, really do. But we have to ask the question, why do artists think they can change the world? Maybe that's the first question to ask. Right? Since the early avant-garde, right? This was, or even go back before that to Saint-Simon, whose term the avant-garde was picked up. Saint-Simon in early 19th century, right? 1820 something, said artists, business and science was going to create a new world, a new socialist world. And they tried it, his students in Algeria. And of course, it was a disaster, right? For all kinds of reasons, colonialism, racism, etc. But the idea of the avant-garde that has kind of continued on to us through the arts is artists have a special place in society, and it's kind of outside the system, and therefore it can shake everything up. And we have a way that we can sort of make things happen. I don't want to completely step on that idea, but I also think we need to really look at it carefully, because to what degree are the arts now integrated into ultra-capitalism? The art market is a 66 billion euro market. What does it mean, if we're doing political art, but we're also part of that marketplace, right? Which is incredibly uneven in terms of its distribution. Again, I'm not saying we don't make art, it's just that we need to be thinking about these questions, right? Shelley.
Okay, so I don't want to go into like a really long political argument now, because it's not we could do that afterwards, after having some beers or some wine this evening. Or and you are extremely knowledgeable and articulate. It's a pleasure to listen to you, Greg. But I kind of don't agree with some of the stuff you said. To begin, I don't agree that the left is dead. It might be dead in the US. Maybe it never existed in the US. Really the left. Yeah. But I don't think it's dead in Europe. It might have been followed largely by like this new paradigm of capitalism in Spain. About Spain now, and now we're going through a difficult moment. In Spain, people don't have to pay for chemotherapy, and people don't have to do a crowdfunding to go to hospital. Now the public healthcare is going through a very difficult moment, because the right and the far right is trying to privatize it. For a long time, we've had one of the best public healthcares in the world, where British people and people from all over the world were coming here. Even North American students come here to be operated, because they're not asked any question. People go to school here, to university, and have a dignified life. And this is because a long struggle of workers, of people in culture, and we're still struggling. So I think, it's a difficult moment now. It's difficult not to be pessimistic. And a lot of things that we've struggled for, and we've been in the streets for decades, many of us, now seem to be like falling apart. But I think that it's really unfair to make that generalization of like the left is dead, especially when you see everything that this country has gone from fascism to democracy. And okay, the democracy is questionable, but there have been a lot of social advancements here and in many other places. Okay, so we can talk more about that later.
Let me just clarify one thing. I didn't say the left was dead. I said it's failed. That's a difference. But okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I also.
That's fine. Yeah, just so we're clear. Yeah.
I think it's going through a difficult moment, but I don't think it's failed.
Right.
I think when you can go to school, to university, and to the hospital without being rich, like you have public services, and you can live a dignified life without being rich, it's difficult to say that. And second, about art, I understand what you're saying. I think it's a super interesting, relevant discussion, what you brought up, and what lady from Mexico was saying, and talk a lot about it. But I don't know if we see, and I'm not trying to be like mamby-pamby optimistic, let's end up this with a good note, etc. But if you think of, and also I don't want to be too historical, but think of Extinction Rebellion, think of Fridays for Future, think a lot of what a lot of artists are doing all over the world, not only in the West and the US and Latin America and out in Asia, Southeast Asia. Think of the Documenta this year, and think of go back to ACT UP. That's, of course, it's made a difference. I mean, of course, it's made a difference. But the thing is, often you do 2 steps forward and then 1 back. But I think it's like a binary way of thinking of have we failed or have we not failed? Does art change the world? Does art? I think it's much more complicated and subtle. And of course, it's made a huge difference, because you can't separate. I think you can't separate art and culture from life, from the world. So it's not, has one thing failed? Has this failed? this continuous advancement. And what you've done is amazing. Like your whole life work is amazing. And of course, it's made a huge difference. But that doesn't mean, oh, just stop gentrification.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm a full professor now. That's one difference. It's
I'm going much more, but I just wanted to.
no, I appreciate the enthusiasm of it, and I know I'm being a little bit provocative purposely. I would say that many of the things you're citing, though, are things that were created by the left for over many, many decades. You know, we also have Social Security in the United States. Most people today don't even realize that was the outcome of real serious struggles in the street, you know, and a socialist agenda. You couldn't convince most people in the US that that's the case because they just don't get history, right? But what I'm talking about is really what's been happening in the last couple of decades. And you see with Steve Bannon and the far right, part of what's going on is not just an appropriation of these strategies and tactics of the left. It's also the idea that culture is where you do battle. Right? They have really taken that idea and they've really run with it. So if we kind of acknowledge that the broader culture in Western societies, US, you know, parts of Asia, obviously parts of Europe in most part, that culture, a kind of liberal idea of culture is enmeshed with the idea of democracy in a significant way. And that came about thanks to these struggles. And I think you said that brilliantly. You could also say that what the far right is doing is saying, aha, nobody's being the really, really radical in the room around these cultural issues. We're going to do that. We're going to just outrage people, misogyny, racism, and we're going to show that you can use culture to really provoke these, you know, sentiments about white race, white supremacy, white nationalism, et cetera, patriarchy, anti-gay phobia, you know. So I think we've seen the ball tossed over to these folks in some way. And I think that's part of the question is how can they do that? And maybe the answer in part is because we've become so attached to the idea that it's culture where we need to do the battle, as opposed to, and you actually cited this, demanding power for the working class, for people of color, et cetera, you know, not just that they have their own TV station or that there's more Black people on movies, great, significant, important. But wait a minute, let's actually talk about where is power, right? Or let's talk about where is a beer. Time for one more maybe, or will we pick it up?
Okay, my English is not the best, but I want to read here the chat. It's Simone from Brazil, and she says that it's excellent reflection about the decision, the society and the governments. And she is speaking also right now in Brazil, we have elections. Left and right is really complicated situation, but I think it's really polarized situation everywhere. It's not only in Brazil, but also in Colombia, also in Italy, also nearly in France, and everywhere. And then I want to ask you a little bit about this idea and this really proud moment, political moment, and if you have some projects in this way, also thinking about Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
And so.
Thank you. Well, now I'm going to take Shelley's side because I'm going to say that there's a lot of really great stuff happening. People are really trying to address these issues, and I think it's significant and important to be part of that. So there's the Institute for Radical Imagination in it's kind of based in Italy, and it's also, I think there's people from Spain, there's people from Portugal, other parts of Austria, etc. Oliver Ressler, who I've worked with before, is an artist who's been doing very interesting work around the issue of the Anthropocene and sort of activism around that. I would say, you know, we absolutely have to continue to protest and be active, and people are doing that. If you look, you know, all around the world, in Serbia, in Russia, you know, people are still trying to be activists, although that's really hard now. And so I guess if I had anything to say, I would say, you know, don't stop, you know, don't become a pessimist and stop, but also don't be able to look at things in an analytical and clear way as well. You know, maybe those two things don't even go together exactly, but you have to kind of consider those two possibilities, because we can't afford, I think, to be lulled into a sense that art is going to change the world, as the avant-garde promised us. And we have to not forget that art could change the world, as the avant-garde promised us. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks.